Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burkt and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by Speedway Properties. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can go to preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. Jim has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company, a publisher of regional books, as well as a coinery. Jim has written over 1,000 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. Jim is on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees and also serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission, and he is also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is a series of talks titled The Complete History of Lincoln by Jim McKee, and this is talk number 26. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
Well, it's not accidental that this is the first picture up, although it is accidental. Happens to be the right day for it, just coincidentally. By 1901, Lincoln had 3 non-doctor-owned hospitals. Now, a doctor-owned hospital, early on, that was where all the doctors practiced, and they were in private hospitals. Usually they owned the entire hospital, but slowly through the years we have hospitals, which we would call general hospitals, where more than one doctor would practice in a hospital that he did not own. And most of those original hospitals, and we've seen several of them, were located in great big old mansions someplace throughout the city. In 1899, the first general hospital came about in the city of Lincoln. And a general hospital we'll define as one where any physician who is licensed can practice in that hospital, and that was St. Elizabeth Hospital. Then along comes Tabitha Hospital, which is also known as Lincoln Lutheran Hospital, which was at roughly 48th and Randolph. Then in 1909, Dr. Benjamin F. Bailey opened his Green Gables Sanitarium or Sanatorium in what had been the village of Normal, Nebraska. So there were 3 hospitals which doctors who were licensed could practice in. Then in 1910, a man by the name of J.E. Miller, along with W.E. Hardy. Mr. Hardy we know from Hardy Furniture, and Don Love. We think of Don Love initially with Love Library. He was also a contractor and a donor to many things in the city of Lincoln. Met at the old Lindell Hotel. The Lindell was right across the street from the Cornhusker to the north, and they formed something called the Lincoln Hospital Association. They foresaw a great, huge city-owned hospital. So they appointed 33 members to their board of directors. Sounds a little bit cumbersome. They suggested that the group of 33 raise $100,000 and that the city of Lincoln raise $100,000, or a similar amount at least, to form a hospital within the city of Lincoln. Then a man by the name of R.E. Moore passed away. R.E. Moore was primarily into real estate in the city. I think he was an attorney. He owned, among other things, a huge tract of land which had been set aside for the city of Newton, Nebraska, which never came about. Newton was overlaid Highway 6, and it's where the drug company today, which has a name I can never remember because they keep changing the name of it. At any rate, he owned a city which he platted in that area, which never developed. And also, R.E. Moore's home was torn down to form Hazel Abel Park, which is quite a nice house. But at any rate, he passed away in 1921. So 1910 to 1921, nothing really had happened. But R.E. Moore, when he passed away, his estate included a $100,000 gift for a hospital for the city of Lincoln to be called the Emily Moore Hospital. That's the way it was specified. And it would be a city-owned hospital with a board appointed by the city council of the city of Lincoln. But the city itself would not own this hospital. It would be held in trust forever. Love that when you put that into a legal document. Held forever and used as a city hospital. Well, of course, we're going to have to manipulate this a little bit, but it's going to come into the original hospital association. And in 1923, Davis and Wilson drew the plans for the building we see here, which would be a 100-bed hospital to cost $250,000 and located on the southwest corner of 17th and South Streets, almost. It was a little bit south of that. Opened in 1925, and instead of a 100-bed hospital, it turned out to be a 100-bed hospital. Then in 1928, the Teeters Trust built the Teeters Nursing Home to the south again. That building has just been raised and is sort of a park area to the south of what we call now Lincoln General Hospital, or more appropriately, Bryan Hospital West Campus. But we all know it's Lincoln General, okay, whatever they want to call it. In 1940, an addition was built to that hospital, making it a 100-bed, 140-bed hospital, 175-bed hospital, excuse me, which was called the R.E. Moore Wing. Then in 1967, the new pod-designed Lincoln General Hospital opened. And if you remember that hospital, one of the quadrants was called the R.E. Moore Wing to that building. Then in 1997, the city of Lincoln transferred their interest in Lincoln General Hospital to the Bryan Hospital Association, selling it to them for $37 million. The reason this is an appropriate building is because this is the building I was born in, December the 12th, 1940. Went the wrong way. There we go. Now we're moving back downtown to the northeast corner of 13th and O Streets, which originally was really the edge of the downtown section, or the edge of the city, more or less, on O Street, although in general it will go out to 17th Street. When we look back, 13th Street, and if we go over to P Street, certainly it's full of houses, and pretty large houses at that. But on this corner, we will see the first building of consequence built, the two-story United Cigar Company building, although it has many names. I call it the United Cigar Building because on the corner was the United Cigar Company. And when I was a little kid, I can only remember walking by that building, and as walking by it, on the counter, there was a gas flame about so tall, it burned constantly. And that was because they sold cigars. And the idea was to buy a cigar and light it right on the spot, and of course consume it so you had to buy another one, I reckon. The site of this building, which had lots of offices in it and of every sort, clear on the right side of this, on facing O Street, was the Wonderland Theater, which went to the alley towards the north. But the cigar company was sold, and the entire building, to Miller and Payne's in 1950. At that point in time, they built a new building on the site, which we will call the Penneys building, virtually windowless at that time. And J.C. Penneys, which had been located on O Street to the west, sold their property to Wells and Frost. Then J.C. Penneys moved from that building on O Street into the building built and owned by Miller and Payne. It seems like an interesting concept for Miller and Payne, who owned the department store on the southwest corner of 13th and O, to build a building for a competitor, if you will, on the northeast corner of the same intersection. It was done certainly with forethought, because Miller and Payne's idea was to make 13th and O the epicenter of retail business in the city of Lincoln. 13th Street was, for a while, kind of engineered to become the second main street. O Street would be the principal street for retail traffic. But a number of people thought that 13th Street would be converted to that, and with that thought in mind, they built the 3 or 4-story building for Miller and Payne's, for Montgomery Ward's, directly across the street from the Cornhusker Hotel to the south. And that building still sits there. Montgomery Ward's didn't exist in it very long because retail traffic did not switch to 13th Street. It stayed pretty much on O Street. And that would become Scott's Pancake House, and now it's an office building directly across the street to the south from the Cornhusker Hotel. So 13th Street did not develop. But Miller and Payne's concept did continue to develop, and they will not only build a building for Miller and Payne, but they will then build a building on O Street directly to their west for Ben Simon and Sons. They will own that building as well and lease those buildings to other retailers, concentrating the retail business right there at 13th and O. And in fact, the city, even the Chamber of Commerce, called that the middle of the business district, 13th and O. And it more or less caught on. J.C. Penneys will have a lease there that becomes so good a lease, let's say, that they will not want to leave there originally or find themselves unable to move out to Gateway when Gateway develops, late 50s, early 60s, because their lease is so good. In fact, the lease, Bob Campbell explained to me at the time, was if a light bulb burned out in that J.C. Penney building, Miller and Payne replaced the light bulb. So they did even the upkeep on the building in order to keep J.C. Penney there. J.C. Penney almost went to Edgewood Shopping Center when it was built, and probably would have, except Hub Hall, who owned that shopping center, when he accepted when he accepted J.C. Penney as a tenant at Edgewood Shopping Center, they presented him with what they wanted their building to look like, and Hub didn't realize that what J.C. Penney intended was that Hub Hall would build a building for J.C. Penney and would lease it from them, and Hub was unable to do that. So J.C. Penney did not go to Edgewood Shopping Center, but finally, of course, did leave 13th and O, and the building was owned by Miller and Payne's for a good long time. There become some exchanges of real estate, part of which will revolve around, you will remember years ago when we talked about the Tucker family owning the building under Miller and Payne's, the two-story portion of the building right on the corner. And that Dr. Payne would not build more than a two-story building on the corner because he had a 99-year land lease on it. And he said, I'm not going to build an 8-story or a 5-story building, which bookended the two-story building. I'm not going to build a bigger building on property that in a mere 99 years, I'm not going to own it anymore. So when he built that Miller and Payne's property, he left it at 2 stories. But he also, when he built the 8-story tower to the west, for example, put all of the utilities that came into the building, electrical, water, gas, and the elevators. Everything was in that 8-story building. So that planning ahead, 99 years down the road, when that building went out of his ownership and back to the Tucker family, he could still operate around it. And through engineering many transfers in there, Miller and Payne will acquire the Tucker property a couple of decades ago, and will then at that time sell and transfer the J.C. Penney building, part of a trade. So they'll ultimately get it all back. And that 99-year lease, of course, just ran out like a year or two ago, but it became unnecessary. The corner, too, is interesting because there, standing in the middle of the intersection, is a policeman with his hand out like this on a sign, which is the stop and go sign. It says stop in this direction, and then he turns it 90 degrees, just revolves it, and it'd be stop in the other direction. So before we had electric signals, we had this device. We are now at the Shrine Club. In 1918, the Shrine and the Masons, two separate organizations under a similar umbrella, but two separate organizations, both were considering building a country club in 1918. Then in 1920, they were engineering a property owned by the Woods brothers, which was the property, well, we call it the country club today. But around that property, the Woods brothers were engineering a trade with the Country Club of Lincoln, or Lincoln Country Club, down where they owned the property, or wanted to own property, where Governor Butler's house was. 8th Street, from A Street to South Street, Washington, right in there. That property was where the Lincoln Country Club was located at that point in time. So the Woods brothers exchange and form an exchange in property where the Lincoln Country Club gets the property they sit on today, and the Woods brothers end up with the property where the Lincoln Country Club had sat. Okay? Kind of clear? It ran roughly from 9th Street to Gooch's Mill, roughly from A Street to South Street. The original governor's home's property. Okay. It was a clever deal that the Woods brothers did right here, and they very rarely did anything that cost them money. They made money just almost always. And it enabled them to sell the lots around the country club for more money than probably would have been worth without the country club there. And enabled the country club then to get in a nice new building and a nice new golf course. The golf course will actually open a year before the building, probably about 1923. And we're talking about 24th, roughly, and Woodsdale in general. That leaves the possibility before the trade, of the country club offering to sell to the Shrine Club the old Lincoln Country Club. And they said, don't build a new club. We will sell you the whole grounds of the old country club for $150,000. And the Shriners sort of held back. They dropped the price from $150,000 to $80,000, but the Shrine was convinced they wanted to build their own club. So that we see the property then go through the exchange with the Woods brothers. And in the meantime, the Shrine is convinced that they need to have their own club. So in 1926, they will buy 660 acres from a man by the name of Levitt, L-E-V-I-T-T. And Mr. Levitt lived in a concrete block house roughly a half a block south of the intersection of 70th and O Streets. And if you think in your brain of the southeast corner of 70th and O Streets, and then think a half a block south, you will see this two-story, roughly cement block house sitting there facing towards the north. That was the Levitt House. And the Levitt family had just sold the land for the Veterans Administration Hospital. We'll be talking about that a little bit later, maybe today. And then that house will become part of the Veterans Administration property and ultimately will be sold off. And now they've just built in there a new retirement or not, that's not quite the right word.
I think it's assisted living, Victory Park Apartments.
Yeah, well, there's two things built in there. The apartments to the west, to the east, and then right in where the house sat, there's kind of a, what would we call it? Not a hospital, not a retirement home, but assisted living sort of thing. Yeah, okay. And of course, we remember, some of us, when they picked up that concrete block house and moved it several miles to the south and east, and it became a bed and breakfast outside the city limits. And that's an interesting story we can talk about a little bit later. The Levitt family will move from there into the city of Bethany. The Levitt House, some of you can picture it in your brain, faced towards the north, and we see it looking like it's about a half a block or a block south of O Street. But if we look at the plat of O Street originally, or even aerial views of that area, we see that O Street goes directly to the east until it gets to almost 70th Street. And then it takes off at an angle towards the southeast and goes directly east, parallel to what O Street is today, but 3/4 of a block south for about 2 blocks when it takes an angle back to the northeast and joins O Street as we know it today. So O Street, at that point in time, was not the longest straight main street in the world. It took a jog there. It takes jogs in other places. It takes a jog at 27th Street. The jog at 27th Street is primarily because the earth is not flat. A lot of you probably knew that. So as the president says, maybe a lot of you didn't know that. I don't know. But at any rate, this jog took off and actually ran right in front of the Levitt House, whose address was O Street, but in a way. And the reason it did that was they wanted to build one bridge on O Street over Dead Man's Run for O Street and Missouri Pacific Railroad. And so they were able to do that by reconfiguring O Street temporarily. Okay, side story. At any rate, Mr. Levitt will also sell the Shrine Club, 660 acres of land, to the east of that property for $80,000. So for the amount they were offered, the country club downtown, they got all that property out there. Now that property ran basically from A Street to O Street, centered around 94th or 95th Street, and takes in a great deal more than the present country club did. 1928, they will open the golf course, 18 holes, par 72 course, while Olson Construction Company builds the sort of Spanish Revival, Spanish Modern, whatever you want to call it, clubhouse. May 16th and 17th of 1930, they will have the grand opening of the clubhouse, which follows the golf course a little bit. The same thing happened to the Lincoln Country Club. They built the golf course about a year before the clubhouse was completed. The building itself, roughly 261 by 144 feet, with a 24-foot tower. Lots of things that don't exist today. They had then, including a small putting green in the basement, like a miniature golf course, which no longer is there. Then they built to the west, on adjacent property, a picnic house, which was an 8-sided house, which was torn down about 18 months ago, 2 years ago. It's gone now, but it had been converted to an individual's home. It was a playground and picnic house for $8,000, which was just off of O Street, about a block to the south. They also dredged a 3-acre lake in there. They had all sorts of stuff around it, playground. That pond was stocked with 10,000 fish that were donated by Charles Stewart, even though, as far as I know, Charles Stewart was not a member of Hillcrest. They put in a wading pool. There were baseball diamonds, a croquet lawn, all in the area over there, and they were in the process of planning a 9-hole small, like let's call it a pitch and putt course, which would have been to the west of Hillcrest that we think of today. But that never came about. Why? The year, 1930. The best of times and the worst of times. They kind of crippled along with the Depression, and in 1934, the present concrete swimming pool was built. So the swimming pool at Hillcrest dates from 1934, and when they built the swimming pool, the filtering system, everything, and that part of it still exists today as it did then. And when they investigated like 10 years ago about whether they should put in a new filtration system, they found out that the old filtration system, which is a sand filtration, probably is good or better than anything they could build. So it still has the 1934 swimming pool and filtration system, which they're once again looking at replacing, which will be a couple of $1 million, I reckon, something like that. Well, with the Depression, the club's membership kind of begins to trickle down. And in the meantime, they've discovered that very few Shriners were using it, and so they opened it up to the Masonic Lodge as well for people to join. One of the problems was so far to the east of the city of Lincoln, and gasoline became expensive, it was just tough to get people to go out there during the Depression. So what they did was the Shriners leased the country club to another individual who renamed it Broadview Country Club. He didn't have any luck at all. By then it was 1938, and in 1939 that gentleman went bankrupt. And in the bankruptcy, we're going to have properties start to divide. But at that time, a man by the name of Gradwall and my father and a whole bunch of other businessmen will step in and purchase Broadview Country Club. They will buy it in the name of East O Realty, which still owns the property, and I still have one share of stock. And that will become then the property of East O Realty Company. They will then establish another corporation called Hillcrest Country Club. And the reason they did this was they wanted to own it, but they wanted somebody else to operate it. They didn't know how to operate it. So East O Realty will lease the property, the swimming pool, the golf course, and everything else to Hillcrest Country Club. Still exists today under a very similar lease. The property was bought, by the way, on an auction on the steps of the courthouse, the whole thing for $37,000. and it's carried on the books as not a whole heck of a lot more than that, but considerably more than that. The picture here is one of the original, if not the original, Golf Pro, as a picture from the Lincoln Journal. The building itself has been reconfigured inside many, many times, and almost nothing is where it was originally, maybe with the exception of the kitchen. But the building itself and the exterior looks pretty much as it did then. And that is it. And then if you go up in the tower and take a picture down towards the swimming pool, and don't think about northeast, south, and west, because the building does not, it's cattywampus and is not truly. And that slide, by the way, John, is upside down, backwards. So, but you probably wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't said it. Now, strangely, also, the next picture is 13th and O. It kind of got out of sequence as well. This is the building being built for J.C. Penneys by Miller & Paints. So we're looking at the northeast corner of 13th and O, towards the northeast. And as I said, it's a fairly windowless building at that point in time. And then, under its present iteration, we will clad it in plywood and pierce it with windows and make some balconies and so forth in it, and will be the building it is today, which is an office building. And I'm sorry, I don't know who the owner of the building is either today. Private ownership.
The Nebraska Student Loan Program?
Yes, the Nebraska Student Loan Program is in there, but I'm not sure what their name is.
Foundation for Educational Services?
Okay, Gene says it's something educational services?
Yeah.
Okay. And I know people that work there, but I was unsure what it was. And I think that's the entire building today. Okay. In this picture, we are looking towards pretty much the south, but maybe the south-southeast, and we're standing pretty much in the front of the current Children's Zoo at the railroad tracks, the Rock Island tracks, and we're looking towards the south-southeast, and we can see a smokestack back there. And basically, we're looking at this building, but kind of from the edge of it. And we can see the railroad cars which lined up along, at that time, the south side, or excuse me, the west side of the building. And that building has been built around, and the smokestack has been converted to 3 metal ones, or 2. So it's difficult to recognize anything in that picture. We're talking now about the Lincoln City Parks. By 1905, the city of Lincoln really had only one park, and that was the 4-square block, 9.5 acre Lincoln Park, which today we call Cooper Park, but at that time was called Lincoln Park. But even in 1905, it was not a park. From the time that land was deeded to the city of Lincoln by the Capital Commission in 1867, literally through its entire history, it was leased by the city council to various individuals every spring for farming. And it was leased for about, originally, $5 a season or a year. And this continues on. So that park, it is a park in name, but there's no park there. In fact, in many respects, the first park we have in the city of Lincoln, I think we talked about last month, or maybe even before that, and that was Wyuka Cemetery, which had in its southwest corner, where now we have a duck pond and a office supply store. Originally, all that was considered parkland. And of course, the trolley car went out that far to service the cemetery, but it was where people went of a Sunday afternoon or for a picnic in the park. That's where they went, and sort of the de facto park. But in 1905, the city is going to purchase land at 27th and D Streets, roughly, for the amount of $13,500. They did not use park department funds at that time. They used water department funds because their idea was to sink wells along the Antelope Creek watershed to provide drinking water and potable water for the city of Lincoln. Originally, remember, the city had about a dozen just wells with windmills above them scattered around the downtown core. One was at the university, one was in the middle of the block where now we have the mill downtown, for example. And those roughly 12 windmills supplied all the water for the city of Lincoln. But as the city grew, we needed more and more water. We were getting about 1 million gallons of water a day from one of the wells, which was located in Lincoln Park on the northwest corner of the 4 square block park. But we have pushed that to its limit. And for a city to exist, one of the things it must have is fresh water, obviously. And at this point, that's the reason we're going to start buying land along Antelope Creek. And that is to sink wells and provide water. That's why water department funds were used originally. But of course, we bought a lot of land, 41 acres of land, which they figured no more than 10 acres of it would be used by the building and the wells themselves, which left 31 acres of land, which they consider now to be used as parkland. And it was the mayor of the city of Lincoln who came up with the brilliant idea of, let's call it Antelope Park. But all he was doing was naming it after the creek bed which ran through there. 1907, William Jennings Bryan, and it's hard to conceive of this, but William Jennings Bryan's land, which we think of around the hospital today on Sumner and 48th Street, his land, some of it came clear down to Antelope Creek. And so in 1907, William Jennings Bryan donated 10 acres of that land to the city to become part of the park. So the park itself is going to grow incrementally. Ultimately, the plan is to connect O Street with 33rd and Sheridan Boulevard with a contiguous park. We really did it at one point in time, but now it's kind of fragmented off. And for example, the end on O Street was sold off first for a drugstore, a grocery store, a drugstore, office supply store, and now it's kind of a minor hospital, doctor's clinic sort of a building. But that's where it originally was going to start. We'll see that in a second. So it was Mayor W.E. Hardy, and this again is the same Hardy who owned Hardy Furniture, and the W.E. Hardy who took the city of Lincoln Drive for the first time. He's the one that names it Antelope Park. Then about 1914, 1915, a man by the name of Cotter Bride, or Cotter McBride, you see his name both ways, will donate to the city of Lincoln some pillars. These pillars stood, I'm not sure where the pictures are going to go. This is just one where the stream ran through the park, rather nondescript, not interesting. Probably in the 1905, 1910 era, someplace here. This picture is of William Jennings Bryan giving a speech when he gave his 10 acres of land. And then Cotter T. Bride, or Cotter T. McBride, whatever his name was a friend of William Jennings Bryan, and he was visiting the city of Lincoln about the same time that Bryan donated the land. And Mr. Bride, or McBride, is from Washington, D.C. And this picture is of the Treasury Department in Washington, D.C. being built and the pillars being put in place. But those pillars are going to come down and be stored in Washington, D.C. as a new Treasury Department building is built. And so Cotter T. Bride buys the pillars and gives them to the city of Lincoln to become the entrance to Antelope Park on O Street. And those will stand, and we're looking now from inside the park, we're looking towards the northeast, O Street running left and right. You can see a picture in there of a car, and that car is on O Street. The building to the left is still there. It's on the north side of O. It has Rickstein jewelry and Rickstein trophies in it. Then the building to the right, where you can see something LOB on it, that building is still there. That is where Knight Plumbing used to be. That building is fragile and very nearly falling down, but is now owned by a person who says they're going to resurrect it. I think it's pretty much a fanciful idea, because I think it's going to cost more to work on it, easily possible. But we can see those pillars standing there. He will also buy a bunch of either, I'm going to look at Matt, bronze to make a plaque, I think it was bronze, not brass, from the battleship Maine, which had been sunk in Havana Harbor, 1898, if memory serves me. He buys enough of the bronze from that to cast a large plaque which tells the story of the pillars and coming to Lincoln and being resurrected there. This picture doesn't show it. However, the park department has a terrible time with the park entrance there. It really doesn't connect to anything. Across to the south is the Muni Pool, and so in a way Antelope Park does go through there, but it's not used as a park, and in fact it becomes a parking lot. And the city parks department is unable to enforce it. So what they do is they sell that land for private investment, and they then ultimately they put those pillars in the city nursery, which, and I again think that was out by Sherman Field, but they then will resurrect those during the bicentennial year out at Pioneers Park as a kind of a ruin. Some of the pillars are standing upright, 2 or 3 of them are laying on their sides, and the interesting thing is, if you're an architect, you know that pillars are not straight. They are sort of like this to fool your eye, to make it look like they're straight. I'm looking at 3 architects here. All of them seem to look pretty straight. But the contractor who put the pillars back up in Pioneer Park was apparently completely oblivious to that. Because if you look at the pillars as he reconstructed them, they kind of go, and he didn't get them in an original configuration. But it's a neat setting, and in fact, the tablet, the bronze tablet, is also out there too. And it sits right next to a pond. It's a very picturesque and nice spot. Nice spot to have a picnic again. Now in 1915, the city of Lincoln now goes to a man by the name of Ault, W-T, Ault, A-U-L-T, whose name is probably floating in the back of your memory for something else. But Mr. Ault lives in Omaha, and they ask him if they can purchase 15 acres of land, or if he will purchase 15 acres of land and give it to the city. I'm not sure whether he owned it or was going to buy it and give it. It's unclear. But at any rate, they want him to give 15 acres of this land so that the park can become a contiguous band. And he agrees to sell it to them. They come to a price which is extremely reasonable. But unfortunately, the city of Lincoln can't afford it. They, even at this reduced rate, they could not afford it. So Mr. Ault ultimately says he will give them the land, which is a pretty good ploy. We ought to try that more often. Plead, and he gives it to him. Now, in thanks to Mr. Ault, these pillars were erected directly to the south of the Auld Pavilion, which was named for him. And these pillars also have a brass tablet on them, and they're directly south of the building. You can see them and the pillars exactly where they were, right near the entrance to Mr. Seacrest's estate, which went from there over to South Street. So ultimately, 7 acres of land is what he gives, almost, probably 3 square blocks of land. About this time, we're also going to, well, let's see, here's a picture of Auld Pavilion just after it's built, and a picture of its setting back in the trees, sometime after it's built. I'm not sure whether we're going to talk about this or not, so I'm going to jump ahead in my thoughts, and maybe we'll have a picture come up and maybe we won't. But Auld Pavilion for a time was the clubhouse for the 18-hole senior golf course, which today has a junior golf course on it. And also the tennis courts, which are over on South Street, they used this building as kind of a clubhouse for them. And I'm not sure today if you would go in there, but if you went in there a couple of years ago into Auld Pavilion's basement, you would have found the locker rooms, showers, and everything from this golf course's use of the building as a clubhouse. Ed Schwarzkopf, a friend of mine, and some of you probably knew Ed, actually worked in the summer at the golf course and told me lots of stories about it. And of course, the lights from Havelock's Ballard Field, some of those will go out to the tennis court on South Street, which is another story we get into later. At any rate, the pavilion did serve this purpose. Then later, the golf course will disappear for decades and be reborn again as, I think they call it the junior golf course today. Maybe it's the Ager General Golf Course or something like that. At any rate, the golf course sat next to there. At that same time, we're also going to begin straightening Antelope Creek. It was rather a winding process through there. And part of that will be the city campground, which we see here on the left-hand side. There was kind of a little shop or a store where you could buy groceries, kind of like a 7-Eleven. Then you could also rent a tent base or a cabin site. And this was located, probably the easiest way to describe it is along Capitol Parkway on the west side. We now have a practice field for the Lincoln High football team, and then we also have to the south of that a Lincoln Public Schools maintenance building. That's where the city campgrounds pretty much lay at that point in time. We're also going to build a house for the park superintendent, or at least it's ostensibly for him. I'm not sure whether he ever lived in it or whether just somebody who worked in Antelope Park lived in it. This house would have sat more or less in the general area of the Children's Zoo today. In other words, on the east side of 27th Street. And I can remember it, but I can't, it's difficult to position exactly because it wasn't on any street. It sat about a block to the east of 27th Street on a winding street, which you can see right there. The Antelope Park is developing at this time. It's developing around a WPA building that's built for the zoo. It also has a zoo in it, which in the summertime, most of the animals are quartered outdoors in cages along Antelope Creek. And tropical plants were planted and so forth. How they did them over the winter, I'm not sure. Originally, there were ponds outdoors for fish and so forth. And we're going to end up moving the Thompson Fountain from just to the southwest of the Capitol building, where it had become, in the middle of an intersection, it had become a traffic obstacle. We talked about all this before. That's the reason I'm not going into detail again. They will pick it up and move it out to Antelope Park, and it will sit, it's hard to explain exactly where it is because it sits very near Antelope Creek and very near what would be probably best described as the extreme northeast corner of the current Children's Zoo. And they will set it in there. It will serve as a sort of a pond where kids play in it for a while. Then you'll see those figures in it that people are climbing on. That's the Neptune portion of the fountain. Sadly, we sold those metal fountains about late 30s to Japan for scrap metal. And as I said, it's sad because probably some of that scrap metal came back to the United States in the form of shrapnel. Hard to say. But at any rate, they will go out. Then later, that center portion will be dug out and made into a habitat for little animals called Coatimundi, which are like small bears. And now I'm not even sure that even the ring is still there, but it was there for a while. Now, as the city tore up we'll call them cobblestone alleys and streets, but in fact, they were not. They were not cobblestones. But the stone streets, as they were torn up, or alleys, were used by the park department to build several buildings in the general neighborhood of the Children's Zoo again, because we're going to have a city nursery in that area, and these little buildings, of which there were probably, I don't know, 4 or 5, I'm going to guess. But you can tell they were very, very crude in their way, but they were stable. There's another one. And they all set around the city greenhouses and that park office. And they were, of course, gone with the Children's Zoo when it developed it. And now where the cobblestones went, I don't know. Now, at the meantime, I mentioned we were straightening out Antelope Creek. And at that point in time, there was right to the south of the auto park, which is where we could lease a cabin for a small amount of money. The cabins were 75 cents, or you could get a tent base for a quarter for the evening. And I don't have pictures of the cabins, but they must have been very, very minor. In 1932, the tourist camp will be purchased by the city. Exactly the ownership before that, I'm not sure. Then, as we straighten out Antelope Creek, we have a cul-de-sac, which would be on the southwest corner of 27th and D Streets. And they're going to, when they straighten it out, that isolates that cul-de-sac Now, the cul-de-sac for a long time is just a cavity, if you will. We can see kids using it for sledding. And also, sadly, in the summertime, it became used as a dumping grounds. People would dump refrigerators and tires and stuff like that in it. So it's really rather disreputable. But what we also forget is that this is the extreme northern edge of the Happy Hour Golf Club. Now, the Happy Hour Golf Club, or golf course, if you will, started at 27th and A Streets on the northwest corner of the intersection. And it ran from A clear down to that cul-de-sac in Antelope Creek. But the Happy Hour Golf Course is going to move from that area and reincorporate itself as the Lincoln Country Club. So they will move out, and those houses which sit in there now, across the street from the Children's Zoo to the west, will be built. The City of Lincoln will now decide what they're going to do with that dump grounds, sledding area, and so forth. Joe Seacrest owns the land on the other side, but he is going to give, first of all, a 40-acre piece of land up near, well, it runs roughly from South Street to Sheridan Boulevard on 33rd Street. This is part of the old Seacrest properties as well. And the farmhouse is still there, completely grown around. When I say farmhouse, it was more or less a mansion. He will give another 40-acre strip. And at that point in time, the golf course will develop. 1930, the property which is directly behind or to the west of the city campgrounds will be a huge greenhouse, which was owned by Sarah and Henry Fry, F-R-E-Y. They will donate about an acre of their land, and the greenhouse will be picked up and moved. It's a huge building, 6,000 square feet under glass, out to Wyuka Cemetery, which they'll have a greenhouse out there for cemetery use. That comes into a great deal of contestation later on as well. Seacrest will also give another 2 acres of land right near the sledding area. Now, the man at that time who was in charge of the park department was a man by the name of Ernest Bear, B-A-I-R. And Harley Bear, some of you may know, who passed away, I think, a couple of years ago. Harley Bear, I think it was his uncle. At any rate, Mr. Bear, Ernest Bear, will then begin to take that cul-de-sac bottom land and develop it. And we're standing here now, probably about 26th Street, Lowell, looking towards the east, and he's going to, these are done with shovels and wheelbarrows and buckets and men. We're going to dig that area out. We're going to form a rock garden, and the area will be designed by a man by the name of Fred Goebel. Then the following year, in 1931, with spring, Mr. Bear hires 200 men in the city of Lincoln, pays them 40 cents an hour. Well, what we're doing is this is like a WPA project. In other words, you're hiring lots of men to do work which could be done a lot simpler, cheaper with mechanical means. We're going to hire a lot of men to dig that area out and do other work, clean out the elbow, and shape the hill as we see it here. They're going to plant 416 trees and shrubs. Then they will comb all over Lancaster County and collect red and tan stones, which they will completely use to develop it as we see here. And obviously it becomes the sunken garden. And the WPA Zoo is going to be built. The cost to the city to build the sunken garden was $2,500 total. That includes the cascades, the pools, and Rebecca at the Well, which is also a FERA, a WPA sort of project as well. 1932, the park is going to be pretty well developed at about its peak. It'll go all the way from 33rd and Sheridan and connect to O Street at, what would that be, 24th roughly. By then, Lincoln didn't have one park, it had 13 parks, which totaled 1,238 acres total. 179 acres of which were in Antelope Park. And of course, it's very sort of convoluted. Sometimes it's like a python that just ate a pig. It'll have these big bulges in it, and then it'll be straight and it'll smaller. Memorial Drive will pick up at All Pavilion and run south of South Street about 2 blocks until it curves around and joins into 33rd Street, and you can still see the traces of that south of South Street in the double row of lilacs, which are still, most of them still living along in there. In 1932, 1933, 4, and 5, the WPA and the FERA will hire a man by the name of Ellis Berman, a sculptor who will design Rebecca at the Well, which stands in the Cascade in the Sunken Garden. The Pioneer Woman, which stands on 33rd Street at about Pawnee or Melrose. That was funded partly by the Lincoln Women's Club. The War Memorial, which is a 4-sided memorial directly to the west of Old Pavilion, and the smoke signal in Pioneers Park. He will build all of those, and they're made, all of them, of concrete, or cast concrete. It's just a winter scene. Now, whenever you still have an area like the Sunken Gardens, and you don't have it drained, obviously, in certain times it's going to fill up with water, as it does here in this picture. I don't have a date on it, but this is as it was probably, as I remembered as a kid, in the 1950s, something like that. Rebecca at the Well is there. And the general shape, as much as it is today, they've added on a little bit to the west. Continues to develop and develop and develop. Then we're looking at the old cast Rebecca at the Well. Rebecca, like the fountain, which is in the area where now we have the Rose Garden, which is along 27th Street to the west of the Children's Zoo. There was a marble fountain in there which had been given to the city by Tony Domino, but vandals had so many times broken that marble bowl, and Mac had tried so many times to repair it that it finally came to the point where it just could no longer be repaired. And the marble fountain was just thrown away. And Rebecca at the Well is beginning to suffer not only vandalism, but just plain wear. Remember, she's made of cast concrete, so water gets into crevices and expands, and she is going to go away. Now, Rebecca will be ceremoniously buried in the Sunken Gardens, someplace. we won't say where, because we don't want you to run out and dig her up. But we're going to completely redo the Sunken Gardens as it exists today. Now, for example, if we were to walk along Antelope Creek up until about, in the 5 to 10 year ago bracket, as we walked along there in the summertime along the bike path, or the old Rock Island Railroad path, you'd be walking along, suddenly you'd hear this noise. Right next to you, it would sound like a car next to you, and what it would be an electric motor. Because all along that path, we had these red brick, stucco, concrete block, and just plain pieces of machinery sticking out of the ground, which were wells, which they were pumping water into the several reservoirs in that area. The reservoirs are all still there, but now, and these were used to recharge the wells, those reservoirs, and supplement water which we're getting from Ashland, which is where now literally all our water comes from. But up until about in the neighborhood of roughly 10 years ago, they were still using these wells. And in the summertime, they would draw water out of them, or they could actually run Ashland water backflow back down into the Antelope Creek watershed. So they could have done either one at that point in time. But now, those wells are all inoperative. And they've gone through there and taken out most of the ones where you've just seen a big piece of machinery sitting above ground. Most of those are gone, but some of the little buildings are still there, but there's nothing in them. And one by one, those are being removed. So this is what the park originally was built around, was used as, of course, water wells. The WPA Zoo is It went from being a zoo, and I remembered as a kid where there were animals in there, and when it was in the summertime, it was extremely, what would the word be? Odoriferous would come instantly to my mind. You could tell it was a zoo. Then they made it into a indoor playground for children, and now it's being repurposed again, and we've built parking lots to the west of it and to the south of it, and torn down the old Lincoln Parks Department building. They've moved into the old Lincoln Clinic building on O Street at about, what would that be, 40th roughly. No, not 40th, it'd be more like 30th, 33rd, yeah, into the Lincoln Park Department is in that building now. And then I see we have a picture which kind of got out of place, and we will put this picture up here, and then we'll talk briefly about it, but it isn't out of place, John. It is where it belongs. Yes, because next time we're going to talk about the Veterans Hospital. But this is that concrete block building, if you will, or house, which belonged to the Levitts, which was on 70th and O Streets. And we have just a couple of minutes left now, so this is a good place to stop and see if there are any questions that have come up today. Or questions about anything, I guess. Having trouble with your income tax? Anything. We'll try and answer anything. Have I answered every? There's a question. Eileen?
So this house, I remember this house facing south.
No, you remember this house facing north.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you approached it, did you approach it from the south?
Not very easily, because to the south was just grounds of the Veterans Administration. Her question was, did this house face south, or she remembers it facing south, but it faced to the north, and it was used for a time by the Superintendent of Maintenance of the Veterans Hospital. Then in its later years, it was empty for a good long time. And when it was empty, of course, when any building or house is empty, what happens? Kids. The windows get broken out. Water went inside. All the oak woodwork was nearly destroyed, for example. And it fell into great disrepair just being empty. So when the gentleman bought it to make it a bed and breakfast and moved it, literally the inside was gone. So he had to really start all over again. But no, it faced towards the north, and nearby it were a couple of small concrete block buildings, which were also water pumps. We'll talk about those when we come back. Maybe January or February. I'm not sure. We haven't exactly nailed down the dates yet. Another question?
Old Pavilion, is it A-U-L-T or A-U-L-D?
I think D-Dog.
Yeah. Well, I thought you said T.
I may have said, I made it sound like Alt, but his name it's the same guy, and I think it's Ald, A-U-L-D. That's my recollection of it. Yes.
How many acres of park are in Lincoln now at this time?
The question is, how many acres of land are now in parks? A whole bunch. Gazillions of acres. I can't answer the question exactly, but I will tell you this, that the last time someone made mention of the figure, it was said that Lincoln, Nebraska has more acres of park per resident than any other city in the world. Now, I don't know, but it's a big number that is drawn quite heavily on by virtue of the fact that Busalis Park is a huge undeveloped park, for example, and a lot of undeveloped parkland. I'll try to look up the answer to that and tell you next time. That brings us to a close. Thank you.